don't know your past, you make an awful lot of mistakes trying to move into the future.
We have no sense of what progress is. Progress isn't looking forward. Progress is understanding what we've had, understanding what our heritage was. We'll never understand the future. We'll never understand the present unless we have some concept of the past.
I'm Frank Cliff Jr., and I'm the grandson of Vincent DePaul Cliff, who is the third owner of 70 Ferry East. I feel that if we don't take an interest in the preservation of Ferry Avenue and similar type neighborhoods in Detroit, our children and our children's children won't have the faintest idea of what it was all about, because unfortunately, historic preservation in Detroit is something that's come to this town rather lately.
At the forefront of preservation efforts in Detroit is Preservation Wayne. Preservation Wayne is Detroit's oldest and largest preservation organization, and since 1975, they have chalked up an impressive record of major accomplishments. They've been instrumental in restoring historic sites and districts, garnering historic designation for Detroit landmarks and neighborhoods, educating the public about the value of Detroit's history and architecture, extending technical assistance to historic property owners, and providing a strong voice of advocacy for the protection of endangered historic structures. Preservation Wayne initiated and continues to lead the efforts to save the East Ferry Avenue Historic District. East Ferry Avenue intersects Detroit's main artery, Woodward Avenue, 2.5 miles north of downtown Detroit. The district lies in the city's cultural center, 1 block from the Detroit Institute of Arts.
Within 3 blocks, you can experience Detroit's history, evidenced through the people who lived here, who built businesses and established institutions here over the past 120 years. And we have very few neighborhoods like this left in Detroit.
The Ferry Avenue district represents a remarkable mosaic of history that spans 100 years of achievements and contributions by white Gentile industrialists, prominent Jewish middle-class residents, and African-American professionals. On Ferry Avenue, one can cherish the memories of an age gone by and the prospect of a restored and revitalized Detroit. It all started with the Ferry Seed Company. During the late 19th century, the country began one of its great growth periods. To feed the burgeoning population, more and more acreage began to be farmed, and this meant an ever-increasing demand for seeds. This proved to be a boon to one of Detroit's most prosperous enterprises, the Dexter M. Ferry Seed Company, helping it to become the world's largest distributor of flower and vegetable seeds. To stimulate its marketing efforts, the Ferry Seed Company developed the use of colorful and innovative packaging. While sowing his fortune with seeds, Dexter Ferry also had a feeling about the growth potential of land values. Instead of buying cheaper land out in the country for his seed farms, Ferry bought near the city's borders. He reasoned that this land would appreciate. He located his test gardens at Ferry Avenue and St. Antoine and built a superintendent's house that still stands.
Right now we're looking at the house occupied by the superintendent or head caretaker of the Ferry Seed Farm. Of course, predates all the rest of the houses on the street, but is probably one of the nicest examples of early Detroit architecture.
In 1886, Dexter Ferry subdivided Ferry Avenue from the test gardens at St. Antoine to Woodward Avenue. In order to attract prominent residents, he established strict architectural standards. The development soon became the home of many notable Detroiters, leaders of industry and the professions. By the 1890s, neighboring Woodward Avenue had become Detroit's Mansion Row. Hundreds of elegant homes lined the street from Grand Circus Park to Ferry Avenue. In 1891, the railroad baron, Colonel Frank Hecker, built one of the most prominent homes on the corner of Ferry Avenue and Woodward. Hecker and his architect, Louis Camper, chose a French chateauesque design for the mansion. In the late 19th century, architects promoted this style among wealthy Americans, especially along the East Coast.
He did choose a style that was very similar to the chateauesque style, much in favor along the Fifth Avenue row in New York City, and it seems to be a style that pleased the Heckers very much. Even inside of the house itself, the variety of details from various periods, various time frames, and even various types of architecture are blended to really make it an American palace.
Hecker's home clearly showed his status as one of the leaders of Detroit's social and business nobility.
Hecker didn't waste any time in building this beautiful, flamboyant French chateau that reflected his own personality. He was very sociable and gregarious and had a large family and wanted to have lots of parties, and his house reflects that spirit of living.
His rise to prominence started early. During the Civil War, he was in troop transportation. This involved the extensive use of the railroads. After the war, as he expanded his involvement in the railroad industry throughout the country, he met Charles Lang Freer.
Freer began as Hecker's protege and eventually became his partner in the business. He was a good bit younger, but he very much admired Hecker's business practices. And Hecker, as time went on, began to admire Charles Freer's taste, so that the two of them had a mutually satisfying relationship.
Hecker and Freer came to Detroit in 1879 to form the Peninsular Car Works with several prominent Detroit investors, including Christian Buell, James Joy, and Russell Alger.
This is a photograph from the Burton Historical Collection of the Peninsular Car Company right at the edge of the Ferry Seed Farm, just a few blocks from Freer and Hecker's homes on Ferry and Woodward. The car building company was actually a merger of several different operations: steam forge, car building works, lumber operations, and by pulling these companies together, they were able to really gain a monopoly on railroad car building.
In 1892, Charles Lang Freer, Hecker's friend and business partner, the vice president of the Railroad Car Company, built this shingle-style residence on Ferry Avenue.
Here we are in front of the house designed for Charles Lang Freer by the Philadelphia architect Wilson Eyre in 1890, which is in quite contrast to that design for Colonel Hecker adjacent on Woodward Avenue.
Hecker and Freer, I should say incidentally, were opposites, complements to each other. Hecker was outgoing and very much the public figure, desperately wanted a political career, which never worked out for him. Charles Freer was more the retiring type who really didn't want a high profile in terms of a public display of any sort.
He liked things to be very simple and direct. So his house, in contrast, is simpler and less pretentious.
This house reflects Freer's involvement with contemporary American architects and artists. Wilson Eyre, the Philadelphia architect, Dwight Tryon, Thomas Wilmer Dewing, and Abbott Thayer, who all had active hands in designing this house for Mr. Freer. It was really a consortium of architect, artists, and patron, all working together to produce what was a contemporary work of American art.
And Freer was influenced by artists like Whistler and tastemakers like Oscar Wilde, who felt that there was something to be said for living in the spirit of art, for manifesting that idea of aestheticism in the place that you lived, so that the house was created as a work of art in itself, with every element contributing to the general harmony of effect.
His growing interest in art led Freer to commission several American artists: Abbott Thayer, Frederick Church, Thomas Dewing, and Dwight Tryon, to create paintings for rooms in his house. Two of the artists became completely immersed in Freer's blending of art and architecture.
He brought Dewing back, and he brought Tryon back to have, in a way, what was you could call a house party. The artists moved in, they brought a New York decorator with them, and they began embellishing the walls with the most incredible surface. And the painters were each given a space in which to locate their works and embellish the room in a way that would enhance their paintings.
Everyone who went to the Freer house commented on its beauty and graciousness. Someone said it was a dream of beauty inside and out.
Freer's sense of aesthetics also dictated how he felt works of art should be viewed.
He made a ceremony out of looking at works of art. You didn't just plop down and look at a Kakemono or a Whistler. Stephen Waring, his very meticulous butler, would bring in refreshments, whether it was champagne or tea, a special blend of tea. And then, after everyone was suitably and comfortably seated, especially at a particular time of day when, say, the setting sun cast just the right glow on the wall, Stephen would bring in a beautiful Whistler nocturne, and you would watch it as the sun set, as the glow disappeared from the painting. It was much more than a gallery. It was a setting for an almost metaphysical experience, aesthetic experience.
While Freer was striving to create a harmonious setting in his home, in the business world, he was considered to be tenacious.
He was as tough as they came. In fact, so tough that he and Hecker were able to push out their fellow investors without the investors even knowing that it had happened. And they found out then by 1885 that they were out of the business. And Hecker and Freer owned the Michigan Peninsular Car Company themselves.
That allowed him to retire at the age of 45 and really begin his career in connoisseurship.
He was out of the active life of a businessman and free to devote himself to art collecting. And in 1901, he established an agreement with James McNeill Whistler that he would have an option to buy all the works in Whistler's studio in return for establishing a collection in Washington, D.C., the capital of the nation where Whistler was born.
I think it was Whistler who really taught Freer how to look at works of art, and it's Whistler's aesthetic that pervades Freer's collection.
Freer assembled the world's largest collection of Whistler's work. Probably the most famous acquisition was the Peacock Room. The Peacock Room began its life in 1876 as the dining room in the London home of a wealthy shipowner, Frederick Leyland. A painting by Whistler, The Princess from the Land of Porcelain, occupied the place of honor over the fireplace. When the architect of the room had nearly completed his commission, he consulted Whistler about the color to paint the dining room shutters. Whistler suggested a color scheme and some other minor alterations. The home's owner, Leyland, sanctioned Whistler's suggestions and then left town for the summer. In his patron's absence, Whistler was inspired to make some bolder revisions. He covered the ceiling with Dutch metal or imitation gold leaf, over which he painted a lush pattern of peacock feathers. He then gilded the shelves and embellished the wooden shutters with 4 plumed peacocks. When he returned and discovered the changes, Leyland was outraged. Whistler's response was to caricature the breach in the scene of 2 angry peacocks he painted on the south wall of the room. While the unauthorized alterations caused a permanent rift between the artist and his sponsor, the room came to be regarded as a masterpiece. After Leyland's death, the room was removed from the house and exhibited in a London gallery. The art dealer knew that Freer had recently purchased the painting that had once been the centerpiece of the room and reasoned that Freer would be a likely buyer.
Freer wasn't particularly interested. He responded to the dealer that he would like to buy the mural and the shutters, but he didn't care to own the rest of the room. And the dealer shrewdly replied that he would have all or nothing. And so Freer decided to buy the entire room.
The room was taken apart, shipped to America, and reinstalled in a new addition to Freer's Detroit house.
The other very important side of Whistler's influence on Freer was Whistler's idea that there were works of art in Asia that Westerners had never seen. On Whistler's instigation, Freer went to Asia 4 times, beginning in 1894, and he traveled to places that most Westerners never did.
And I think people appreciate the fact that he undertook an almost Herculean task, and that was to assemble works of art in cultures that were virtually unknown to Americans.
While Freer became an internationally renowned collector, he also assumed the role of a leader in the Detroit arts community, fostering its development. For example, Freer was an avid supporter of local artisan Mary Chase Perry, the founder of Pewabic pottery. He commissioned works from Pewabic for his collection and for his home. While Freer valued his ties to Detroit, he shared Whistler's desire to have his collection permanently housed in a gallery in Washington, D.C. Freer gave his collection and the funding for a gallery to the nation.
There's no way one can say that he wasn't committed to Detroit. He was, and he loved Detroit, and he loved the cultural institutions that were there. And his house, I think, is a way of remembering a man who really was the major cultural force in Detroit. And I think there's every reason to restore the house and bring back this very carefully calculated Whistlerian environment that once flourished in the city that became the city of the automobile.
By 1919, when Freer died, some of the families of the original residents had begun to move out of the neighborhood. The area was slated to become the city's cultural center. The library, art museum, and other institutions soon shared this once exclusively residential neighborhood. As evidence of this urban change, Freer's home was purchased by the Merrill Palmer School for Motherhood Training. The Merrill Palmer School was started as a place where women could learn about raising children, marriage, and human relations. At the time, there was little educational focus in academia on home and family life. Child development was a new field of study.
Well, I was always intrigued with Merrill Palmer's founding. Lizzie Merrill Palmer, who never had children, left this huge sum of money for 1920 for the study and improvement of life for families. It was really, it was in the tradition of the women who, such as Eleanor Roosevelt, who were active in the settlement house movement. It was also a part of the feminist movement that led to the vote in 1920.
In 1922, Merrill Palmer opened a nursery school designed to be a center for student study and practice. It became a model emulated worldwide. Over the years, Merrill Palmer brought together experts in the fields of psychology, medicine, nutrition, home economics, sociology, and education to study children and family life. The Institute helped develop national policy in the areas of daycare and preschool standards. As a laboratory school, patterns of nutrition, growth, play, and rest were closely reviewed and evaluated. Theories were tested and some discarded.
The children had to sleep outdoors. They had to take their naps outdoors. That was the English influence. And they had snowsuits that were gray snowsuits, pants, tops, hoods, and they were dressed inside, and they were blanket around them, and a maintenance man came, carried them out to their little cots that were set up out underneath this big porch-like thing, and the teachers had to sit outside
with our winter coats.
With our winter coats and a blanket and so forth, the whole time the children were sleeping. It was the first thing I changed when I became head of the nursery school.
I was here, came from the age of 2 until 5, 1924 to 27. So this was an experiment, and obviously I was a child. We were all, what did you say? We were all...
We were lab people.
Lab, yes, laboratory.
Laboratory material.
Rats. But we had, I can remember having our teeth, plaster casts of our teeth every year. And I can remember that we had to also eat everything before we got desserts. And I love desserts, so when I had green beans, I would stuff them in my cheeks and eat dessert. And I would keep those green beans, what I'm told, until my mother came at 4 o'clock. This was after naps and everything else. And then I'd clean them out.
As the school grew, it acquired other older homes on the first block of Ferry Avenue for offices and student housing. The gracious Victorian homes provided a comfortable and stimulating setting for campus life. However, by the late 1950s, Merrill Palmer felt, like many institutions of the time, that in order to compete in the modern era, they had to show a modern facade. Eventually, several historic homes were demolished to make way for new classrooms. Its board of directors was bent on growth, but trouble loomed.
It's always nice to be on a board where the institution is growing, where the institution is internationally renowned, and therefore there was a tendency not to look too carefully at the books.
With Eleanor Ford, the wife of Edsel Ford, and other wealthy benefactors, the board assumed the necessary resources would always be available. But like many other Detroit institutions, they came perilously close to extinction. Eventually, in 1982, Wayne State University stepped in to acquire the institute and ensure the continuation of its educational mission. With Wayne State University's ownership of the Freer House, a new era of historic preservation awaits. By 1920, when the Merrill Palmer Institute acquired the Freer House, the auto industry was booming, and the neighborhood's wealthy families began to move to points east and north. Despite the changes, East Ferry Avenue retained its appeal as a residential community. The stately homes of Ferry Avenue were attracting the next upwardly mobile wave. Between 1915 and 1935, the Ferry Avenue neighborhood became the center of Detroit's Jewish community.
I don't know why my father chose Ferry to live on all the time, but I guess it was because it was next to such a prestigious neighborhood that he liked it here.
Very, very elegant community. It was considered that if you lived in this particular area, you were very, very comfortable.
Well, the reason that it became a Jewish community was that they were all Orthodox at that time, and they all had to walk to the synagogue. So there were a number of synagogues around here. Our synagogue was on Farnsworth between St. Antoine and Beaubien.
Today, the Third Baptist Church at Ferry and St. Antoine occupies the area's only remaining synagogue building. One of the most noted rabbis in this community, Rabbi Levin, lived on Ferry Avenue. His granddaughter remembers Rabbi Levin.
As long as I lived here, I remember Grandpa living next door. And everybody who was a very important Jew in the world, if they came to Detroit, this is where they ended up. I met them all.
And on the high holidays, he would always come in a Prince Albert and a high silk hat, and with a picture of dignity, if there ever was one, and everybody just were awed by his presence.
In 1921, when he was 61, he contracted pneumonia and died. He was laid in state at his home on Ferry Avenue and Brush. Thousands came to pay their respects. It was the largest funeral in Detroit's Jewish history. In 1926, the Pascal Lodge Community Center opened on 275 East Ferry Avenue. Known as the B'nai B'rith Community Center, the Pascal Lodge became a focal point for music, art, Jewish culture, and charities. Just south of Ferry at St. Antoine and Kirby, the United Hebrew Schools Kirby Center was established.
Well, it was the first institute of education that we had with its own building that we built, that this community built.
This is where I learned and studied and got all my heritage.
Overall, the memories of the Ferry Avenue area are fond. Living in the city's cultural center offered children many opportunities for learning and for fun.
We would go to the art museum and they would show movies every Saturday morning for kids, educational films, you know, and that was a big recreation. But then we could go upstairs and watch Diego Rivera, who was painting the murals.
As Ferry Avenue was becoming the city's cultural crossroads, the Gentile upper-class homeowners, the Jewish community, and a burgeoning African-American middle class were finding a common ground at the Ferry Avenue Balch Elementary School, today known as the Golightly School.
And we used to like to go to school with the Jewish kids because we would have our regular holidays, and it looked like the Jewish kids would have a different holiday. So the school was 90% Jewish kids, so therefore we had our holiday and we had their holiday, because there wouldn't be nobody in the schoolhouse, you know, on their holiday.
It was built right between the different neighborhoods. Now, it was on Ferry between St. Antoine and Hastings. Just Hastings and beyond was black over here. And this area, as you approached Woodward, became more and more affluent. The very last block between John R. and Woodward had the richest people, and those children often arrived in school with a chauffeur-driven car.
We're talking about 3 blocks. You're going from millionaires to doctors and lawyers to down to maybe postal employees, which is still a good job, but civil servants. And you rub shoulders with those people to whatever degree they would allow you. My dad used to say, well, I used to watch The Rich Boy, but it was always through the fence.
We hardly paid any attention to being a minority then because we assimilated so that we had on the same school, same clubs, so we didn't pay much attention to that.
African-American families had been living in the Ferry Avenue neighborhood since the 1920s. They flourished, establishing thriving businesses, service organizations, churches, clubs, and schools. Hellenius Phillips, city planner, recalls the founding of his grandmother's music school, the Bertha Hansberry School of Music, and his grandfather's employment agency.
Bertha Hansberry was a native Detroiter, and she studied music at the Detroit Conservatory of Music, and then took a postgraduate course in Berlin, Germany with her instructor Elizabeth Johnson from the Conservatory of Music. When she came back to the United States, she decided to teach children how to play the piano. My grandfather in the basement ran an employment agency, and we believe it was the first black employment agency in the city of Detroit. And as an outgrowth of the employment agency, he also started what was called the Household Arts Guild. This was a program that he devised that taught people how to operate the various new electric gadgets that would be found in households. And also, my grandfather would send a number of the people from the Household Arts Guild to some of those mansions in the first block of Ferry Street.
Job opportunities were limited, but the African-American community responded by trying to overcome the obstacles, stressing self-sufficiency with black-owned businesses and job training. In these efforts to make a better life for Detroit's growing African-American community, women provided a great deal of leadership.
The reason the black women came together was because in the early 1900s and the 1920s, the system itself did not address the needs of black people relating to social issues, employment, and what have you. So the women got together and organized the clubs, and their purpose was to try and better the conditions of black people who were coming from the South and migrating north to find jobs.
The headquarters for Detroit's Black Women's Clubs is still located on Ferry Avenue. The acquisition of their own building in 1940 was made possible by its president, Dr. Rosa Slade Gregg.
Dr. Gregg mortgaged her home, her husband's business, all of their possessions, everything that they had to secure the mortgage for this home.
Rosa Slade Gregg was a civil rights pioneer, whose work was recognized from Ferry Avenue all the way to the White House. Her leadership roles in the local and National Association of Colored Women's Clubs put her in the spotlight. She eventually became president of the National Association and was consulted often by the Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations on issues affecting the nation's black communities.
I do remember the pictures on her mantle as I'd come in, and there was a picture of her and President Johnson, a picture of her and President Kennedy. And one of my favorite pictures was a picture of her and Mary McLeod Bethune.
Dr. Gragg's success prompted her to find ways to help others master the skills they would need for their own success and self-sufficiency. She threw herself into this effort by establishing the Slade Gragg Academy of Practical Arts in a triplex on the third block of East Ferry Avenue. The academy became known as the Tuskegee Institute of the North. Ferry Avenue had established itself as a center for the training and education of Detroit's African American community. In 1939, Violet Lewis had relocated her business school from Indianapolis to Detroit. Her daughters recalled their first impressions of Ferry Avenue.
We knew nothing about the city. Mother knew nothing about the city. So what she did is she just drove around. And what she told us was she was looking for areas where the streets were clean and there wasn't debris and trash. And she somehow got over on the John R. corridor and saw Ferry and the homes and the yards, and that attracted her. And the building on the corner of John R. and Ferry had a for sale sign. So she called the realtor and began to negotiate and purchased the building.
We were a secretarial school, basically. She taught, and we were 9 months. She taught English, shorthand, typing, a semester of accounting,
office machines,
filing. Everyone had to take spelling, and you took it the whole time that you were there.
Most of them, when they completed the program of study, we're talking now the early 40s, there was discrimination in hiring at all government levels, in private industry. So most of our graduates went to black businesses, like there was Great Lakes Mutual Insurance Company. They hired a large number of them.
After World War II, due to the push for integration and the students' exceptional skills, Lewis College of Business was among the first schools to provide employees for white-owned businesses.
Our graduates, and then they could take shorthand 120 words a minute for 5 minutes with no more than 5 errors. They could type at 70 words a minute for 5 minutes with no more than 5 errors. I mean, there were criteria, and of course they were well qualified. So when employers decided that, yes, it is time for us to hire African Americans or minorities, Lewis was the source.
Over the years, the college provided thousands of students with marketable skills. The first black operators at Michigan Bell and the first black clerical workers at the auto companies were among those trained at Lewis. The college remained on Ferry until 1972 and continues its educational mission today in Northwest Detroit.
The historical significance of Lewis College of Business to Detroit is that the college provided a reservoir of trained people that knocked down doors of discrimination in employment. And it's significant because without the institution, without Lewis, we would not have had that cadre of trained people when the opportunity came.
Established in 1946, the Fritz Funeral Home is a reminder of the period between 1900 and 1950 when African American businesses flourished in this section of Detroit. Across the street from Fritz's Funeral Home is another long-standing African American institution, the Omega Psi Phi Fraternity. The Detroit chapter was founded in 1923 And 19 years later, in 1942, the fraternity purchased its current Ferry Avenue headquarters. They've lovingly maintained this 1890s home since then and have used it for chapter meetings, social functions, and as a base for their many community activities. Another prominent Detroiter whose life has intersected with Ferry Avenue is Josephine Love. In 1969, she established a unique fine arts teaching museum called Your Heritage House at 110 East Ferry Avenue. Your Heritage House is a living museum and creative laboratory that provides the environment for nationally renowned and developing artists to share their knowledge with young people. It was only natural that Your Heritage House would be established in the Ferry Avenue neighborhood. Josephine Love's wedding reception was held down the street at the Detroit Association of Women's Clubs. Her physician husband was a member of Omega Psi Phi. Her daughter's enrollment at the nursery school broke the color barrier at Merrill Palmer, and Josephine held her first art exhibit on Ferry Avenue.
I think that Detroit has never had as a wonderful concentration of very enterprising African American people as the ones that they had in this neighborhood.
There was always social activity on Ferry Street. There really was. If there wasn't a dance or party at the Women's Club home or at the Omega House or some Dr. or Mrs. Preston or Dr. or Mrs. Mosey or Violet Lewis wasn't giving a party, especially during the holiday season. It was really a very interesting and exciting street to be on.
You could come to this neighborhood for just about anything that you needed, from birth to death.
Beginning in the 1960s and continuing into the 70s, the area was targeted for urban renewal and clearance by the city. Officials argued that space was needed for the planned expansion of the nearby cultural center institutions. That planned expansion was never fully realized.
And at that particular time, the policy leaders in Washington were saying that our neighborhoods and our communities can't be saved with anything less than a total clearance approach, and that the answer to blight and urban decay was wholesale neighborhood clearance and redevelopment. And so that was the agenda for the day, was the urban renewal program.
And there was an actual blue book plan, that's what we call it. And it's a beautiful brochure showing what this cultural center would look like. And it was distributed all over the country. This became so much of a known plan that people would stop moving into units in that area, because they would say, well, why should we move into this area if the building's going to be acquired in a few months, a year, or whatever. Property owners stopped putting normal maintenance into their buildings because they felt, why should I do this? I won't be reimbursed.
In Detroit, we suffered a great deal through the urban renewal approach. As you know, there are vast tracts of land that are still vacant, that were never redeveloped, and probably maybe never will be, given the sort of market conditions that exist in the city today. And so in the process, I think we destroyed a lot of our history, a lot of what was very valuable to the city, and things that can never be replaced.
We had a nice tree-lined street here. It was beautiful. I mean, you could drive through and see the trees growing over the street there, and everyone, even though this is a multiple resident area here, everyone took pride of ownership and of occupancy.
And the street stayed very beautiful until like the late 60s. Then urban renewal came in. It was really sad. It was kind of like the city forgot about this cultural area.
Urban renewal was the villain as far as this neighborhood was concerned, because people felt that they were very insecure in their ownership of property. And of course they were right. The neighborhood has never been rebuilt as it was when I first knew it.
Alarmed by the demolition, Preservation Wayne launched a campaign in 1979 to halt the destruction of the East Ferry Avenue neighborhood. The first step in the struggle was to have the area placed on the National Register of Historic Places. State and local historic designations soon followed.
Preservation Wayne as an organization made a decision to focus on Ferry Avenue to see what role the organization could play as an effective third party, working together with the residents and property owners and with key institutions in the area and with the city to see what could be done to promote investment in those buildings and in this very valuable and very important historic district.
So our ability to hang on to Ferry Street and create that as an historic district was a real victory in the face of all of this drive for, if it's old, get rid of it.
Things have come to a halt, certainly, but I can remember the time when buildings were destroyed willy-nilly. And I think because of the offices of the Historic Advisory Office and Preservation Wing, that a halt was put on that.
While the coalition to secure historic designation succeeded in stopping the bulldozers, it did not stop the more insidious process of demolition by neglect. Preservation Wayne recognized that only half the battle had been won, and in 1985, they began to work for the eventual restoration of the Ferry Avenue Historic District.
Preservation Wayne has played the key role in bringing public attention to this particular historic district, Ferry Avenue Historic District. This group has been at it since 1979 through many different methods: public tours, feasibility studies, historic designation, events, displays, exhibits, publications, any means possible that the organization and its many volunteers could find to spread the word about the value of preserving Ferry Avenue and investing in this historic district as one of the jewels of our city.
One recent success, the transformation of the Hecker Mansion, Smiley Brothers Music Company, into the main offices of an important Detroit law firm, illustrates what can be done.
We get to participate with Preservation Wayne and with all of the many good people in this area that have a sense of preserving the historical significance of this area. The thought of losing this historic area, to my way of thinking, for us Detroiters would just be a tragedy. It'd be a disaster.
Ferry Avenue could be, and is in many ways, a living historic district. It's at the doorstep of the cultural center, and it's a gateway to Detroit's cultural center, and yet it's a neighborhood as well. It's really an effective bridge between our key cultural institutions and one of our most important historic neighborhoods.
I think Ferry Avenue can be a wonderful model, not only for this community, but for communities all over the country, all over the world for that matter.
The multicultural heritage of East Ferry Avenue and its blend of historic and contemporary architecture can teach civic leaders, residents, visitors, and tourists about the importance of our past and the ways we can bring new life to our cities through historic preservation and restoration.
There clearly is a lot of interest in people seeing these historical locations. After all, in Europe, when you go visit, you see buildings that are many hundreds of years old, and nobody thinks of tearing them down for urban renewal, and they are great tourist attractions. And certainly in our own city, we want these kinds of buildings preserved that contain our history and our roots.
The challenge now is to see what the future holds for Ferry Avenue. The richly detailed architecture and streetscape of Ferry Avenue invite visions of brick patios, walkways, flower planters, historic lighting, and restored buildings, rivaling any in America. Ferry Avenue can truly be a treasure for all Detroiters. The University Cultural Center Association, the Founder Society of the Detroit Institute of Arts, the City of Detroit, Wayne State University, and others are now stepping forward to help Preservation Wayne fulfill its vision.
This is really an opportunity for us all to work together and accomplish our individual needs while accomplishing a greater objective, which is really revitalizing the Ferry Street neighborhood and giving it a life and making it an attraction and making it a very special place to be in the city of Detroit.
Preservation Wayne encourages you to share its dream by supporting the restoration of Ferry Avenue and other Detroit area landmarks and historic districts by joining as a member, a volunteer, or as an active restorer of historic buildings. Help us invest in Detroit's future by preserving its past.